So let's now go ahead and walk through the structure and functionality of the server. And this will get us a chance to talk about some of these cool newer features. Again, this is really focusing on the PrimeCheck server controller and the PrimeCheck server service, and shows how they are structured to check the primality of large, odd integers asynchronously. So let's look at the controller part first. So the controller is defined in the controller file, no surprise. It's a REST controller, so that's an annotation that says to Spring how to demultiplex incoming requests to these particular endpoints and return the results in a sensible way. We have two primary methods in the controller. One is called checkIfPrime, and that takes a strategy and the number we want to check for primality. And that's kind of boring, honestly, but the one that's interesting is called checkIfPrimeFlux. And as you'll see in a second, that takes a flux of integers and does the checking. As always, we use our get and post mappings to tell Spring how to route the incoming HTTP requests to these methods, these endpoint handler methods. We put the path names here, which of course are defined in a constants file so that we can be consistent between client and server for the get and post requests. Here's where things get interesting. So you'll see that we have another annotation here, or a variant of an annotation, part of the annotation, called consumes. So this is part of the post mapping. And what this says is that this particular method consumes the data that's sent to it in application new line delimited JSON format. What the heck is new line delimited JSON format, you might ask? Well, you can read about it in more detail in the link at the bottom of the slide. But in a nutshell, what it does is the client will send the requests in a JSON format that looks something like this. So you can see it's value 23. That's one of the values. New line. Next value, 371. New line. And so it can basically stream out the data in that format. This is actually not really valid JSON in some sense, but it's used to stream the data. And that way, the data doesn't have to be sent in one fell swoop, which is the nice thing about using streaming, is it gives you this ability to take the data and to send it in smaller chunks. Now, this particular example doesn't really illustrate this in great detail because it does pretty much send them all in one fell swoop. But in general, it will arrange, in general, you could have streams of data flowing over time. So that would be the way that you could make this work in a more fully asynchronous way. And then, of course, this annotation says that the data that comes over is coming over as part of the request body as opposed to part of the URL that's sent with HTTP. Let's talk a little bit about the service. So the service is a service. It's annotated with the service annotation so that the Spring framework can do the appropriate class path scanning and auto detection and auto wiring and dependency injection and so on. We have this interesting data structure, which is an array of PC abstract strategy classes. And PC abstract strategy is a base class, as we'll see, or a superclass. And we initialize it with two instances in the array. One is the PC for PrimeChecker concurrent flux strategy, and the other is PC parallel flux strategy. We could do this other ways, of course, but I wanted to consolidate it in one place. Here's the checkIfPrime method, which is actually in the service class, is just going to take the request that comes in and check it, see what the value is. And it does it, as we'll see here, by indexing into that array, this array over here, using this strategy. And the strategy is then going to be used to tell which of these things to demultiplex to. Here's the parameter. And then this, as you can see, says take the strategy, index into the array, and then call whatever happens to be at that point. However, that method isn't very interesting. The way we get it dispatched is kind of cool, but it's not that interesting of a method. This is a more interesting method. This is the one that's going to check if a flux is prime. So it takes the strategy and the flux, and then it goes ahead and forwards to the appropriate implementation method. Speaking of the implementation methods, here is the PC abstract strategy interface. As you can see, it's got a default implementation. Default implementations are a feature that was added in Java 8. And what they do is they allow you to provide an interface, but define the method's default behavior, which could be overridden. In this case, we don't override it because all it's doing is it's just checking to see if a number is prime. This one, however, is more interesting because it checks if it's prime using a flux. So there's actually a couple different ways to do that using the parallel flux strategy and the concurrent flux strategy. And we'll look at that when we actually walk through the code. So that's the end of the overview of the server-side structure and functionality. We're going to talk about the implementation here next.